have to read.
Yeah.
All right. So, good evening. Time to begin a new Masechet. We are going to move into Masechet Yoma. And Yoma is about Yom Kippur, or Yom Kippurim, as it's often referred to in the rabbinic texts. Now, for us, when we think about Yom Kippur, we focus primarily on rather lengthy services and the fasting and other forms of ritual restrictions that we have on that day. But if you lived 2,000 years ago, well, that was all definitely still in place, and Yoma will still talk about that, as well as the concept of tshuva, of repentance, of what it means to return to God. The other thing that's going to dominate this Masechet is the avodah, is the worship service that involved the sacrifices at the altar in the Temple of Jerusalem. So there are a number of things that will be happening that if you stick around on Yom Kippur and don't leave, you'll recognize from the machzor, from the service that we do, where it talks about the service. We're going to look at it in even more detail, which hopefully will make your Yom Kippur experience even better. But you'll also see there are a number of very important points being made about this time period, about the service, about religion, about belief, that come sort of along the way. So it's not just reading about sacrifices. There are many very important additional ideas that are happening. Nata?
We learned already something about sacrifice in the service, correct? Was Sanhedrin? Which one was
well, we've learned a few places here and there about different sacrifices. Pesachim is where we learned the most, because when we talked about the Pesach offering that was used for the Seder. But we're going to do a lot more in this one. And did Michelle see the door? Was somebody there? I'll wait for her to return, because must have been someone else coming in. Please stand by. Waiting, 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 waiting. She must have seen someone drive up. Oh, we wait. That sounds like the door. So how about that weather? Well, she's talking to someone, so assuming she's not talking to herself.
Yeah.
All right. So Yoma, chapter 1, Mishnah 1. And since our usual volunteer reader isn't here, you're going to volunteer. Now, I do have to say that, as an aside, personally, nothing to do with Yoma per se, but just for me, Yoma was the first Masechet of Mishnah that I learned in rabbinic school. So it's always got a special place in my heart.
7 days before Yom HaKippurim, they removed the high priest from his house to the chamber of the counselors, and they set up another priest to take his place, lest something should occur to him to disqualify him from being able to worship.
All right. So what's happening here? What they are doing is the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, is normally, of course, married and has a family and all of that, which is going to become important in just another sentence. Are we having trouble? It's front and back, yeah. Is of course married and all of that. But for Yom Kippur, there is a very big issue that is looming, which is the Kohen Gadol is going to go into the Kodesh HaKodeshim. He is going to go into the Holy of Holies. And although the stringencies are always strict, he has to go in there for the Yom Kippur service. And only he can go in there for the Yom Kippur service. It's the only time of year, in fact, that he will go into that part of the temple. What happens if he can't? Right? Well, so that's the idea of having an understudy. That's tachat. That's the guy who is there, who is appointed to be in his place. But there's something else that they also say, which is he is separating from his family for 7 days. Why? Because what are the things that might happen? He could break his leg, he could get sick, but
sex, impurity.
Ritual impurity, right? What happens if while he is with his wife, she suddenly becomes nida, she suddenly becomes ritually impure due to the cycle, and boom, he's now out of action, long past Yom Kippur. That would be a problem. So they remove him from his family so that he can remain in a state of ritual purity more carefully. And we're going to do more than just that in a few sections. But they also appoint an understudy so that even if with that precaution something should happen, there is still a Kohen Gadol backup ready to go on Yom Kippur. Because Yom Kippur is not a day that you just put off. And there's no one else who can do it. It's not like you can have like other sacrifices where other Kohanim can always do the sacrifice, even if one particular can't. There is only the Kohen Gadol to do this particular service. So we're focusing on this. Now, Rabbi Yehuda is going to turn up the dial on paranoia.
Rabbi Yehuda said they even prepare another wife for him. Wow, in case his wife should die. As it says, and he shall make atonement for himself and for his house, Leviticus 16:6. His house, this refers to his wife.
Right. So first of all, the very end phrase there of the Midrash, that when you use the word bait, that you are talking about your wife. That doesn't mean his wife is as big as a house. What that means is that a house is made with the wife, that it's not just his house, that it is a combined joint built effort. But that also means that since it says specifically in Leviticus 16, by the way, which I do recommend that you read before we get much further, because we're going to go into some of the details of it. And if you, chapter 16 of Vayikra, you should definitely read as homework, because when we get into the actual ceremony, remembering that chapter will really help a lot. But it says that he makes atonement, he makes kapara for himself and for his house. And if his house means wife, then that means he needs to have a wife for whom to make atonement on behalf of. If his wife dies, then according to Rabbi Yehuda, he would be out of luck. How could he fulfill the fullness of the ceremony if he's missing an important component? He's missing his whole house because his wife has died.
Who choose the wife, the second wife?
Well, anybody could do. I mean, there's a little bit stronger restrictions for a Kohen Gadol to marry someone than for a Kohen. Exactly. There are a slightly higher bar. But the idea would be you'd have a woman ready, that if his first wife died, boom.
He knows who is the alternative.
It doesn't matter. I mean, literally, in this particular case, Rabbi Yehuda is saying he just needs a wife.
No, think about it. You know the alternative and you like her,
Oh
make an
my
accident
God.
to your wife. So
But he's already been separated. He's already been separated from his wife. He's already been separated from his wife.
Yeah, but permanent.
Ta-da. So we are going to be suspicious of the Kohen Gadol in just a little bit, but we're not suspicious of him of murder. So that's not the issue. And in any case, the rabbis respond to Rabbi Yehuda and say,
They said to him, if so, there will be no end to the matter.
right, in Cain, ein ladavar sof. Right? If that, then there is no end. Because, okay, but what if the second wife dies? Then we should have 3. But what if the third one dies?
No.
Then we should have 4. Right? What if a meteor falls from the earth? Then he should always be in an underground bunker. Right? Basically, if you are going to always imagine what if, then you're paralyzed, right? Because you'll never be able to be 100% absolutely perfectly. So having a problem with ritual purity in your family, yeah, that happens, right? It doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen with some regularity. So we do want to take a little bit of a precaution, separate him from his wife for that 7-day period. And we want to have an understudy just in case. But appointing backup wife and a backup wife to the backup wife and a backup wife to the backup wife to the
becomes ridiculous.
It becomes ad absurdum is the Latin phrase, meaning that your position would lead us to an absurd end because it goes on ad infinitum, it goes on forever, and that would be impossible. So the sages reject Rabbi Yehuda's precaution, exactly his idea. Okay.
You know, this is already every time people talk about what if and what if and what if, I knew there must be something in the Talmud about, and we just found it.
Yes, yes. It's also, by the way, if you want another really great example of it, in the beginning of Psachim, when they're talking about clearing out the chametz in the Bavli, it talks about what happens if after you've done Bedikat chametz, the search for chametz, you see a mouse carrying chametz run into your house, and then you see it leave, but without the chametz. Or what happens if you see a weasel carrying a mouse that has a piece of chametz in its mouth? And they say, you know what? No. Teku, right?
We learn in Mishnah Torah.
Mhm.
What is the minimum amount to break a fast?
Exactly. What's the minimum shiur, right? So, in kain in the davar sof, right? If you're going to be so careful that you have to take a level and a level and a level and a level, then there is no end to what you could do. It would go on literally forever. So they say that's enough. Get him out of his house, give an understudy, and we're good. Okay, but now we're going to get more of the hints of what the politics were like during the Second Temple period. Okay, so we're on Mishnah 2.
All 7 days he sprinkles the blood and burns the incense and cleans lamps and offers the head and the leg.
And go ahead and read part 2.
And on all other days,
Meaning the rest of the year.
If he wants, he offers. For the high priest is first in offering a portion and has his first place in taking a portion.
Okay, so the second is the normal, which is high priest doesn't have to be at the altar every single day. Right? If he wants to do an offering, he can do an offering. And if there's a particularly nice sacrifice lined up, he is absolutely the first one who can say, could someone get the door? He's allowed to say dibs on that sacrifice and to take the meat from it because he's the Kohen Gadol. And that gives him special standing. Just wait a second to make sure that Nathaniel has been collected. As my Bait takes him home. Well, that's what we said,
Yeah.
right? They're both okay? Okay. Okay. So the idea here is that, yes, if you're the high priest, you can do this, but you don't have to do this. But for the 7 days before Yom Kippur, he has to. Every day he has to be out there doing the blood sprinkling, offering the incense, cleaning the lamps, and doing the portions of the sacrifice that he will have to do for the Yom Kippur service.
Why?
Practice.
But what if there's an accident and he become to be impure
Okay. Well,
in a job?
well, there's not a question of impurity because everything that comes up to the altar is ritually pure.
Yeah, but heart, maybe his hand or something.
He could cut himself. He could burn himself. All these
Yeah.
other things. But what happens if he doesn't know how to do it?
In order to be a Kohen Gadol, first he needs to be Kohen. So he already passed many years of doing it.
Excuse me. How do you become a Kohen?
The king choose one of the Kohanim.
Okay. But how do you become a Kohen in the first
He has to be
place?
a son.
You're the son of a Kohen. What other requirements do you need to be a Kohen?
You have to-
0. You can be a Kohen if your dad's a Kohen, and he's a Kohen because his granddad is, and so on, back to Aaron, which we talk about actually during this section of the Torah. But that's it. And in fact, this is the problem that they're worried about. And we're going to see even stronger language than that, which is many people were appointed to be Kohen Gadol by the king because it was a very political time, who were not worthy. They were not worthy in character. And they also weren't worthy just in skills. They didn't know how to do the service, but it was a very cherry political appointment. And so you would absolutely want to have your buddy be Kohen Gadol if you were the king, even if your buddy was a total fool. And that meant that there was a period where many of the Kohanim, many of the Kohen Gadol were not fit for the job. But they are the Kohen Gadol, which means Yom Kippur is coming up. He's the one going in. He's the one doing the service. And that means we need to make sure he's ready. So imagine, for example, if we had in American politics a system where somebody could be appointed to a very important position that no one could question or stop. What would happen for the bureaucracy that had to now deal with this person, right? They would be working really, really hard. They would be working really, really hard to make sure this person did the job at least to the minimum correct, right? They would be saying, okay, so you're welcome to this particular department. I know you've never even heard of what we do or know of what we do, but we're going to tell you what we do, and we're going to have to teach you how this all works so that when you're out there representing us, God help us, right? That's what's happening here, is they knew the Kohen Gadol was going to be stuck on them, and the rabbis wanted to make sure that when he performed the service, it went right, because the nation is depending on Yom Kippur being done properly. And they have no control over who's doing it. They only have control over how they teach it.
And he only had one shot to do it.
Yeah, it's only one day, and you don't get to do a makeup.
Wow.
So, yeah, it was a difficult time, which Mishnah 3 is going to reinforce.
Section 1.
Mm-hmm.
They delivered to him elders from the elders of the court, and they read before him throughout the 7 days from the order of the day. And they said to him, Sir High Priest, you read it yourself with your own mouth, lest you have forgotten or lest you have never learned.
Right, so this is literally, we're going to read to you how the service works. We're going to read you chapter 16 of Leviticus, because maybe you've forgotten, or maybe you never learned. Right, so the possibility here of having a Kohen Gadol who doesn't even know one of the most important sections of Torah about the duties for the Kohen is very real. And they knew it. And so they, diplomatic, you know, my honored Kohen Gadol, we're going to read this to you and we need you to repeat it after me, right? We're going to say it and you're going to repeat it. And we're doing this just because maybe you forgot, or maybe you're an idiot and never learned it. But in any case, everyone gets the same treatment. Right? So there is a certain level of compassion that everyone's getting the same treatment. They're not saying, oh, this Kohen we don't have to teach because we know him, and that one's an idiot and we do. No, everyone's getting it so that we're sure that everyone knows what they're going to do when they're Kohen Gadol and go through that door.
What happens if you refuse? I don't have time and I don't want.
Yeah.
Because I don't think it's mandatory.
Well,
He can refuse.
And
he has the king behind him.
we're going to get there in just a second. You're always anticipating just one Mishnah ahead. That's okay. Right. So the question of how would he respond, we're just about ready to come to. But let's read section 2 because it's going to raise another issue.
On the eve of Yom Kippur, they show him various animals so that he will know which ones are which and which ones are
You jump to the explanation, but read the Mishnah itself.
Oh, that's, well, and, oh, hello, thank you. In the eve of your HaKippurim in the morning, they place him at the eastern gate and pass before him oxen, rams, and sheep, so that he may recognize and become familiar with the service.
The guy doesn't know an ox from a sheep.
Oh.
He doesn't know, but he's probably not that familiar with exactly how the slaughtering works of these ones and which parts of the animal are going to be used on the altars and which ones aren't.
So if he did the slaughtering, he had to be conscious of how to do it.
Yes,
right? So,
absolutely.
and that's a big skill.
Well, yes. Now, he probably would have known in general, but this is kind of like, you know, if I were to ask any of you, you know, again, we'll use a sort of modern politics example. You know, all of you, I'm sure, at some point took an American citizen thing, you know, where you had to learn the basics of the Constitution in your civics class, right? At some point, maybe you had to learn the Constitution has, you know, the preamble, and the Constitution talks about the legislature and the executive and the judicial. You probably knew that. But if I were to ask you to have to teach Constitution perfectly, or else the country would be destroyed, would you like a review?
No.
Yeah. Now, if you were a constitutional law professor and you've been studying the Constitution from that civics class you had when you were a kid all the way to the point where you're now teaching constitutional law as your job, you probably wouldn't need their review. And we would like to imagine if we were going to choose someone to represent America as the expert in our Constitution, we'd choose somebody who was an expert in the Constitution. But in these days, the Kohen Gadol would not be chosen from the experts among the Kohanim. He'd be chosen from the person that the king thought was most politically advantageous to have in that position. And that meant that you could get somebody who was part of the Kohanic families that were aristocracy, that were important, that were, movers and shakers in the families, but didn't necessarily know the job of the Kohanim very, very well. Because there were many Kohanim that didn't spend much time actually in Jerusalem. They spent time doing other things around the countryside that had nothing to do with their Kohanic duties. And often those people were the ones who were more high and mighty and exactly the kind of families that the king might want to choose. If you've studied any medieval history or Renaissance history, this may sound really familiar with how you pick a pope. And it is, right? Because you're picking a pope not necessarily by having the most perfectly pious and learned person, but by the one that will bring the most political advantage to your interests. And the Medici were the most famous for this, but everybody played that game. And back in this period, unfortunately, we were playing that game with the Kohen Gadol to such an extent that they,
the most important person.
Well, in Christianity, so is the Pope, and yet they were playing the same political game, right? Because as soon as somebody has any power, influence, or importance to the community, then you want to be sure you're the one controlling him. And that's how it works, unfortunately. All right. Mishnah 4.
All 7 days they did not withhold food or drink from him. On the eve of Yom HaKippurim, near nightfall, they will not let him eat much because food brings about sleep.
Okay. So
it's interesting that the reason why he cannot eat, not because it's the beginning of Yom Kippur, it's because they want to be sure that he will not be asleep.
Yes.
He will be awake.
Now, first of all, why is sleep a problem?
Because he will not be awake and he will be already with all the readiness for if something happens to do correctly on the sacrifice.
No.
He can make mistakes. No?
Because he might have a wet dream.
Oh,
He might have a wet dream, a problem while he's asleep. And then he'd be ritually impure. Right? So the reason they're keeping him up is not because it's giving him kavanah. It's not because they're giving him, more focus and intention and be ready for this and all of that. It's so that he doesn't make himself ritually impure while he's asleep. Because that's the one thing you can't control. Is, when you're asleep, these things can happen. But if you're not asleep, then we can make sure it doesn't happen.
So was this like all the 7 days, right?
No. So the ritual impurity that comes from that kind of emission is not as long lasting. So they just had to make sure that right before Yom Kippur, the day before, that he wasn't in danger of having that happen. So he got to sleep the other times. It's just right before they made sure.
But he could eat either because was he allowed to eat because he was doing the sacrifice?
So he gets lots of special dispensations, right? So not just for the eating, he is going to be bathing. There are many things that he does that the rest of us don't get to do on Yom Kippur. But when you have the entire fate of your nation on your shoulders, we can cut him a little slack.
But in the worst case, can he go to the mikveh? He has 30 minutes, how long it takes a mikveh. So he can still go before the service.
You're still ritually impure until nightfall. Right? You go to the mikveh to cleanse, but the ritual impurity as far as sacrifices goes lasts until the nightfall of the day you immerse. There's a lingering in terms of the temple sacrifices ritual impurity. So it's complicated, but that's what they're talking about.
So the Kohen Gadol didn't sleep?
Nope. And
the whole night?
Nope. The whole night. We're going to talk about how they hold on. We're going to talk about how they kept him from sleeping in 2 Mishnahs. So first we have to get back to more of the sad stuff of what it was like to be in the politics of the day. So now we're on Mishnah 5.
The elders of the court handed him over to the elders of the priesthood, and they took him up to the upper chamber of the house of Achias.
All right, so remember, he was with the elders before of the court, and they were the ones who said, do you know what a sheep looks like? Right, they were the ones who were teaching him generally. Now he's going to his brothers, the other Kohanim, but the leaders within the brothers, the cardinals, if you will, and they're taking him up to the chamber of Avtinas for their own ceremony.
They adjured him and then left. And
Right.
they said
So adjure, by the way, means to force someone to take an oath.
Oh.
So like if you go to court and you put your hand and raise your hand and say, I solemnly swear, that's an adjuration. You were forced to swear something. So that's what's happening here. They're going to force him to swear.
And what is, oh, that's what I'm reading.
Mhm.
And they said to him when leaving, Sir High Priest, we are messengers of the court, and you are our messenger and the messenger of the court. We adjure you by the one that caused his name dwell in this house, that you do not change anything of what we said to you.
All right. So the adjuration is you have to swear now that you will do what we have taught you to do.
Okay.
So this is, you asked, right? He's the high priest. He can do what he likes, right? Yeah, but they're now making him swear a full oath, right? Not just, yeah. But he is swearing by God that he is going to walk into the Holy of Holies and not change anything.
Yeah, but if he does something and break the oath to God, the punishment comes from Shammai, not from the land.
Yes.
So he can say, okay, I'm inside, no one see me, because I'm the only one that can go entry there. So who knows? No one.
So according to our sages, it is exactly that attitude. That is the reason why no Kohen Gadol during this period ever did 2 Yom Kippurs, because they were dead by the next one.
Really?
There was a very short life expectancy because they consistently misused the office and broke their oath.
Oh, wow.
Right? This was not a job that had a good track record of people.
So really they had natural death
Well,
during the year.
define natural, right? You know, by the hand of heaven is what it's the term that's used in the text. Not giant lightning bolts, but what do you call cardiac arrest?
So why someone can accept that position, knowing that in a year you will be dead?
Why would you want to be Saddam Hussein? Because you think you will be the dictator who isn't murdered and killed.
But statistically, after 10, 20 years, always some copy the same.
You always think you'll be the one who won't.
Yeah, that's true.
Plus, as we get to the last line, we'll explain.
He turned aside and wept, and they turned aside and wept.
Right, so
Oh.
they're crying, he's crying because of the state of affairs that forces this to happen. Now, what was the state of affairs that happened here? The state of affairs was the rift between the Sadducees and the sages. And the Sadducees had their own interpretation of how the service was meant to be done. And the sages had the correct interpretation of how the service was meant to be done. And if you believed in your heart as a Sadducee that the way that your group believed it should be done was the way God wanted it to be done, then even if people before you had died, you'd probably still go ahead and do it anyway. So it's both political, but it's also a question of their faith, of what they thought was right. And unfortunately, yes, we can stand back and say, look at the track record, right? This is not good. But they were willing to risk it because they thought they were right.
So for how many years happened?
It's unclear exactly what the timeline was. They didn't give specific dates in the Midrash.
Rabbi, when the Pharisees held, the Sadducees were more in control, or the Pharisees were more in control, depending on the season and time?
Well, the Sadducees were usually more in control politically, and the Pharisees, who were later replaced by the rabbinic leadership, were usually more in control in terms of actually preserving the knowledge from previous generations, as well as the population approval. That is to say, the average person thought that the Pharisees and then rabbinic Judaism, which was a outgrowth, but not identical to the Pharisees. It's blurred by unfortunate historical misinformation. but they were always more popular and more widely regarded as knowledgeable of what was really supposed to be done.
But they were really not in much control as for the...
Not during the days of the kings.
Okay.
Remember, these are kings that were set up by the Romans. These are not independent Jewish kings. This is the clan of Herod, who were put in power precisely because the Romans wanted to control them and through them control the nation. So we have a corrupt king with a corrupt high priest, and the rabbis are trying to make the best of it and hoping that they can steer them in the direction of actually having a successful Yom Kippur service. It's no fun.
Yeah,
No fun. All right. Mishnah 6.
If he was a sage, he would expound, and if not, the disciples of the sages would expound before him.
So this is during the night, right? Remember you asked, how do you stay awake all night? So they would talk Torah. And if he was wise, then he would share words of Torah. And if he weren't wise, then they would share Torah for him to try and keep him awake.
Kind of tikkun Shavuot, about the different.
But one-on-one. Yeah, you got a group of people trying to do a tikkun for one guy and to keep him going. Then if he's smart, he can do it himself, with them. And if not, then this is an aleph, this is a bet. Kind of, keep going.
If he was familiar with reading the scriptures, he would read. If not, they would read before him.
Right? If he was familiar with reading the Torah, then he would read.
Wow.
But if not, what kind of Kohen Gadol doesn't even at least know how to read the Torah? Well, unfortunately, there were some that didn't know that. And therefore, they would read it to him. Sad. Onward.
From what would they read before him? From Job, Ezra, and Chronicles.
So these were considered to be especially interesting types of books that would captivate the audience and keep them going. And in particular, Job, and then the next, go ahead and read part A.
Zechariah ben Kevutal
Mm-hmm.
Says, I have often read before him from Daniel.
Right, so he says, actually, he also read from Daniel. Now, Daniel and Ezra are both partly in Aramaic. This may be also a subtle indication that the Kohen Gadol might not have even known Hebrew so well, that he only knew the generic language of Aramaic from the time. So by reading to him and stuff in the Aramaic, he would know it better, but at least we're reading to him from Tanakh, rather than, reading to him from some newspaper. And the other books were considered to be either beautiful or exciting and would keep him on focus and engaged so he didn't fall asleep.
This sounds like the process for the predecessors. How do you say this?
I don't know the word. Finish.
Before Haftarah.
The predecessor, yeah.
The predecessor before Haftarah.
Except all of the texts are from Ketuvim, not from Nevi'im, right? They're from the writings, not from the prophets. So, but the idea of reading a little bit from additional parts of the Tanakh, that was something that we always did and always were supposed to do. The Haftarah was to do it in the time of the Torah reading, whereas this is not supposed to be the Torah reading. This is how do you keep him awake, but also keep him on task. And so it's similar to, but the idea that we should be reading from these books at other times, well, of course we should be reading from them. Here they have just an ulterior motive, which is keep him awake, keep him awake, keep him awake. Long night. Because Mishnah 7 tells us more techniques. What?
If you wish to sleep, young priests will snap their middle finger before him and say, Sir High Priest, stand up and drive the sleep away by standing once on his cold floor.
Oh my God, they were in ruin.
Yeah, I mean,
Stand up.
yeah, literally. Come on. You look like you start dozing off. Stand up on the floor. Come on. Get your move a little bit, get the oxygen going, right? And of course, the stone floors would have been cool. And so that would have, sent a little shiver up and it would have helped. It's just amazing how practical this particular section of the Mishnah is.
They will keep him busy until the time for the slaughtering or the daily morning offering would arrive.
Right. Keep him busy. I probably would have translated that as they keep him occupied. meaning that they're not going to let him just sit in the chair and rest. They're going to keep him engaged, even if they have to take turns, in order to make sure that he is up and ready right for the first moment that the offering can be made.
So they could be still reminding him processes, don't forget this, or
unfortunately, yes. Yes. All right, and the last one from chapter 1.
From chapter 7? Chapter 1?
Chapter 1, Mishnah 8.
Oh, okay.
Didn't we finished 7, didn't we?
Yes,
Yeah, okay.
yes. Every day they will remove the ashes from the altar at the cock's crow or close to that time, either before or after.
All right, so the first we're setting the stage, which is on the altar you would have ashes left over from the things that had been burnt over the night that needed to be cleaned off. And those ashes needed to be cleaned before you could start the new day sacrifices. So on an average day, you would do this around the rooster, right? When the rooster's crowing, a little before, a little after, break a day, you get ready for the new day. That's normal. However,
but on Yom HaKippurim from midnight and on the festivals at the end of the first watch,
that's when you would do it. We can put a period there. So on Yom Kippur, you would be getting all of the ashes done at midnight, right? And the idea here was you did not want to wait a moment beyond the time that you could do the sacrifice. You wanted to have everything ready absolutely early and done. And unless there was a problem, you needed to have it done early. The other thing is that they say that the Kohen Gadol would have done the ash clearing for this particular one. And they wanted to make sure that he could do that and then rest a little bit before he actually did the main work of the day. Make sense? Okay, and then we're going to see how great people's attendance was.
And the cracked scroll would not arrive before the temple court was full of Israelites.
And you didn't even get to the rooster before everyone was already there.
Wow.
Right? Yeah, imagine going to shul and it's like the crow hasn't, the cock hasn't even crowed, and it's already full.
Wow.
Already full.
Like at service 9:30 and it's packed.
Yeah, service 9:30 and it's absolutely filled. I'd be happy with that. I'd be happy with that just on Yom Kippur.
One day, amen.
Yes. I remember up in Baltimore when we would start early for Yom Kippur. And, we would be starting like at 8:30. Yes. Sometimes for the first, Kaddish Yatam, the first morning's Kaddish, we didn't always have a minyan because people were still bringing themselves in. Yeah. Preparing spiritually, exactly. They were standing on the cold floor at home and lost track of time. Exactly. All right, so that's we're just going to do the first chapter for today, and we will do more next week.
Oh, very
I know, but I only printed the first chapter. I didn't think we'd go through it that fast. I'll have to print a couple chapters for next time. You guys, you study too quickly sometimes. Sometimes we spend an entire week on like 2 Mishnayot, but sometimes we just zoom.
What I love